The way that Joe Biden wants to go is he wishes to degrade us at home, both morally and economically. And this is a major, major problem. And this is leading to significant conflict inside the United States. So, for example, yesterday, Joe Biden had a tweet, and it seems like a small thing, but it's not. Joe Biden was tweeting out, obviously, he's targeting the so-called MAGA Republicans. By MAGA Republicans, these people who he labeled last week, threats to democracy, right? The real threat is not China. The real threat is not Iran. The real threat is not Russia. The real threat is you, if you're a person who disagrees with him. And when I say if you're a person who disagrees with him, I really mean that. Like Joe Biden has labeled people who disagree with him MAGA Republicans, and then he has labeled MAGA Republicans semi-fascists who are a threat to democracy. He did that last week in one of the worst speeches I've ever seen by an American president. So he tweeted out yesterday, because yesterday was Labor Day, quote, "We understand something that MAGA Republicans in Congress don't. Wall Street didn't build this country. Working people did." Now this seems like silly pablum, right? I mean, it seems like, okay, fine. He's just doing his Bernie Sanders routine. But understand what he's actually doing in this tweet. He's doing a couple of things. One, he's labeling half of Americans the enemy. And two, and that has nothing to do with Trump, right? What makes you a MAGA Republican is apparently you think that Wall Street is important. And two, he's undermining Wall Street. Now, there are a lot of problems with Wall Street dependency on Washington. But let's get one thing straight. On an economic level, capital markets make countries strong. If you look back at that entire history of charts that I just showed you, the countries with the strongest capital markets dominate. Britain had the strongest capital markets leading up to World War I, and even between World War I and World War II, the two strongest capital markets on planet Earth were in London and New York. Those were the strongest capital markets. Pretending otherwise is stupid. Every country has labor. And when Joe Biden says Wall Street didn't build this country, working people did, that's just idiocy. I'm sorry. There's a combination of Wall Street investment and working people. You can't have one without the other. Labor without Wall Street means nothing. Wall Street without labor also means nothing. But to pretend that capital markets are not a massive factor, and indeed, the key driving factor behind the growth of an economy, is unbelievable stupidity. And to label people who actually understand economics the enemy of the country, which is effectively what he's doing when he says they are MAGA Republicans, is ridiculous. Now, you can treat that as normal political rhetoric. But the fact is, if you wish to see a strong America in terms of economics, which means a strong America capable of doing what the United States, even if you're an isolationist, capable of doing what the United States did during World War I and World War II on those charts where suddenly you see America's economic might transformed into military might. Boom, you see that chart where it just explodes America's military might? If you're ripping on Wall Street, the capital markets, the possibility of innovation and investment, of course you're undermining the strength of the country, which is what Joe Biden is doing right there. His agenda is the Philip Larkin agenda. Bring the money home, redistribute it, and don't grow. Well, there are real threats to that, international threats to that. All right, so let's talk about, again, looking at history, the way that the West destroys itself is through cutting military spending, which is necessitated by cutting your economy. Economic strength is all, and economic strength in the end also has to rest on a moral basis, a belief in yourself, a certain level of confidence as a country, and all of that is being undermined. So Joe Biden continues to push bad economic policy that is predicated on lies. I cannot get over the fact that he says that Wall Street didn't build the country, and if you believe that Wall Street was a massive part in building the country, that we've had labor literally for all of time, right? Human labor has existed since people were living in caves and going out and smacking animals with rocks for food. Human labor has never been the absent factor. Capital markets are a massive thing. And if you wish to have a powerful country, you have to have capital markets. You have to have investment. You have to have the infrastructure to build that sort of thing. And this makes you now the enemy of the republic, according to President Biden. That is a country that is ready for collapse, that is ripe for collapse, that is being promoted for collapse. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is blaming his inflation on car prices. Well, did it ever occur to him that maybe the policies that he has promoted have helped inflate those car prices? Like, for example, when you keep outsourcing manufacturing of chips to China, that's kind of a problem because China can cut off the global supply chains. When you decide that you're going to inflate the economy by spending extraordinary sums of money on garbage green energy policies, you're strengthening your enemies. And here's Joe Biden blaming inflation on cars.
I also signed the Chip and Science Act, a groundbreaking law. Will once again manufacture semiconductor chips that power every day, everything, our smartphones, dishwashers, automobiles. By the way, the reason why last year, inflation was so high, you know the biggest reason? Cost of automobiles. You know why they cost so much? They didn't have the computer chips to make the automobiles.
Okay, well, if you want to maintain the computer chips that make the automobiles, you know what you have to make sure of is that Taiwan is secure, since 92% of all advanced semiconductors, those are the chips, are produced in Taiwan. Well, in order to do that, you have to stand up to, wait for it, China. And if you're not going to stand up to China because you're going to weaken yourself militarily and economically, then you can expect those cars to get a hell of a lot more expensive over the course of the next few years, which they will anyway, thanks to his green policies that are driving actual affordable cars off the road. And not everybody can afford to buy a Tesla. I mean, Tesla has a massive backlog. And Joe Biden is still bragging about his economic recovery. Here he was over the weekend.
We're delivering for working and middle-class Americans now. Now. Nearly 10 million new jobs, more jobs than ever been created at this point in any presidency in history. Wages are up. Unemployment remains near a 50-year low. And the big reason for all this is the American Rescue Plan that I signed into law shortly after taking office.
Yeah, massive inflation under Joe Biden. And of course, promoting his quote-unquote green agenda. Right? That Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive spending boondoggle, $1.2 trillion or something. He's going to continue touting it, even though all it does is drive up the spending on crap green energy projects, which are not going to generate jobs. They're only going to be wasting money. And the reason they're doing that is because, again, the conflict that Democrats see is not a conflict between countries. They don't see a geopolitical conflict. They prefer to see the great moral conflict in the world as environmental and internal. Right? Those are the two things they're actually fighting. They're not looking at the world in a competitive way, the way that you would if you were a 19th century politician looking at the balance of power. If you're Bismarck or if you're Disraeli, you're looking at the balance of power and you're trying to figure out exactly how do we make sure that our country maintains its strength. In the early 20th century, there was an understanding, or at least a regained understanding after World War I and after World War II, that power matters. So instead of looking at the globe geopolitically, instead of looking at our global competitors, we're looking internally. Understand that's what climate change is about. Climate change is not about competing with China. Climate change is about competing with ourselves and destroying ourselves. I mean, listen to John Kerry talk about climate change. He says we're in a war with the climate. Well, in reality, the international sphere is a Hobbesian war of all against all. The real war you have to fight is the war against China. I'm not talking about a military shooting war. I'm talking about you better maintain your competitive edge against China or they will go to shooting war with you. You better make clear to the Russians that if they cross this line, they're going to get clocked or they will go to war. But instead, what are the Democrats trying to go to war with? They're trying to go to war with the sun. They're trying to suggest that this is the real war. The real war is against two things, the sun and your neighbor. Okay, that is a country in a state of decline. That's a country ripe for the picking. Here is John Kerry.
The world is going to get to a net zero carbon economy. We will get there. The challenge is, will we get there in time to avoid the worst consequences of the crisis? We got to treat this like a war. I mean, literally mobilizing every facet of our economy to deal with it. And I'm not an alarmist. I'm not a Cassandra on this. I believe we can deal with it. We can win the battle.
Okay, they talk about global warming like it's a war, but they talk about China like it's a friendly competition. That is not the way this works. And they're pursuing policies that are likely to result in a significantly weaker American economy over the long run. All because the real enemy is racism. The real enemy is climate change. The real enemy is whatever ghost is in your closet today. This is what happens when you have unserious leaders in a very, very serious time. This is why they outsource all economic policy to the Federal Reserve, because they don't have the actual balls to look at the situation the world is in and decide on powerful economic policies like we had in the 1980s. Again, the decade you want to repeat is the 1980s. Nobody thinks the 1980s are right around the corner, not under Joe Biden, not unless people wise up. I mean, in California, you have Governor Gavin Newsom in the middle of a massive power crisis. I mean, they don't even have a grid that works over there. And meanwhile, he just signed into law an increase in wages in California for food workers to as much as $22 an hour. These are not policies that are designed at strength. These are policies that are designed as weakness. And at the idea that the people who are really your enemies are not the people overseas who have a different view of the world that is predatory and nasty, as they do in communist China. The real enemies are your neighbors. And this is what Joe Biden has been promoting. Again, the real things that the West is so internally focused right now on the moral battle that it's having with itself. It's so focused on things like environmental policy that undermines its own global competitiveness, which is what you're seeing in Europe. Right now, you have Vladimir Putin, who's basically holding the entire continent of Europe hostage because it's going to get real cold this winter. Germany has to keep its nuclear power plants it was about to take offline online. They've declared an energy emergency. This is all because of a West that has followed, again, that two-part pattern, losing its moral way, the Rudyard Kipling moral way, and then turning internally to spend money on silly garbage in an effort to feel better about itself, the Philip Larkin way. Okay, so the United States seems to be following that pattern under Joe Biden. Last week, Joe Biden essentially declared war on half the country. He said half the country is an enemy of democracy if you disagree with him. He literally said the only good Republicans are the ones who work with him. the ones who do his political bidding. He tried to walk that back a little bit last week, but then he doubled down. So the walk back began. He said he was asked about whether Trump voters are a threat to democracy, and he tried to walk it back after saying they were.
Do you consider all Trump supporters to be a threat to the country?
No, everyone. Come on, look, guys. You keep trying to make that case. I don't consider any Trump supporter to be a threat to the country.
I don't consider any Trump supporter a threat to the country? Okay, so now you're lying. Which is it? He had to walk it back because he looked like a fool in saying this sort of stuff. But then the walk back didn't last for very long. Karine Jean-Pierre, the incompetent White House press secretary, she was asked about why Joe Biden had made an eminently political speech with Marines flanking him against a blood-red Independence Hall on the taxpayer dime. She said, well, standing up for democracy isn't political. It's only political if you call all of your political opponents the enemy of the republic, which is exactly what she did and what Joe Biden did. Here she was.
You could address the criticisms and the questions about why the president delivered what sounded very much like a politically charged speech as an official White House event, taxpayer funded, with 2 Marines in uniform in particular flanking him and visible on camera throughout the
So
speech.
I'll take your first question. Look, the way we see it here, and I would argue the way many Americans across the country see it, is standing up for democracy is not political. Denouncing political violence is not political. Defending rights and freedoms is not political. Making clear that the challenges facing the nation is not political. We don't call any of that political. We see that as leadership, and we see that as presidential.
It's presidential leadership to call half the country your enemy. And it's not political at all to say that half the country is your enemy. As I say, Joe Biden tried to walk it back a little bit, but not much. He started railing against the so-called Trumpies, right? He keeps coming up with new nicknames because he keeps trying to drag Trump back into election 2022 so he can run against it. Here was Joe Biden calling people Trumpies at his rally over the weekend after saying, well, don't worry. The people who voted for Trump aren't the enemy.
The biggest contrast from what MAGA Republicans, the extreme right, the Trumpies, they want to go to Congress. These MAGA Republicans in Congress are coming for your Social Security as well.
Again, he starts trying to make a distinction, then he conflates everybody back together. This, of course, necessitates idiots like Jamie Raskin, the Democratic congressperson from Maryland. He was out there defending Biden's rhetoric, saying, no. Of course, Joe Biden's enemies are the fascists. And this is not the way that you are going to strengthen the United States vis-a-vis its external foes. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.